Hey guys, and welcome back to the Political Whiz, where you will find all the whiz on politics and history. And today, we will be analyzing the 2020 Kansas Senate Republican primary, which will be held on August 4th, 2020. And now, let's take a look at the candidates' profiles. Kris Kobach started his political career serving as a member of the City Council for Overland Park, Kansas. In 2004, he won a competitive Republican primary for the 3rd Congressional District of Kansas, but ultimately lost the general election to the Democratic incumbent by about 12 points. He then served as a chair for the Republican Party of Kansas for 2 years from 2007 to 2009. He then served 2 terms as Secretary of State of Kansas from 2011 to 2019. In 2018, he ran in a competitive gubernatorial election for the state of Kansas against Democrat Laura Kelly. He narrowly won the primary election, but ended up losing to Democrat Kelly by a margin of 5 points and is now running for senator for Kansas. Our next candidate is Roger Marshall. Roger Marshall was a doctor who formerly served as the chair of the board of Great Bend Regional Hospital. He first ran for Congress in 2016 from the 1st Congressional District of Kansas. Marshall unseated the Republican incumbent that year and ultimately won the general election and won a second term to Congress by a landslide in the 2018 midterms. He is now running for senator of Kansas. Our next and final candidate is Bob Hamilton. Hamilton is an entrepreneur who started his own plumbing business in 1983. Over the course of 37 years, his business expanded and now has more than 160 employees. Hamilton and his wife started a nonprofit company called Giving the Basics in 2011, which is a nonprofit that donates hygienic products to low-income communities. He is now running to become Senator of Kansas. We are now going to take a look at the significance of this race. The reason why this race has received media attention is because in this year's Senate election, the Senate seat in Kansas has been rated as a competitive election, and the Democrats are aiming to pick up the Senate seat in Kansas. One might ask, well, how is this going to be a competitive race if this is a traditionally red state? There are 2 reasons for the Senate seat being competitive. 1. The incumbent Republican Senator Pat Roberts is retiring after serving 4 terms as senator, and when a Senate seat or a congressional seat is open, this usually gets competitive since the constituents might want new leadership or a change, so they usually would vote for a candidate that is the opposite party of the incumbent who is retiring. Again, this usually happens, but this doesn't always happen. The second reason is the 2018 midterm election results from Kansas. In 2018, the governor's election was an open one, with then-incumbent Governor Jeff Collier declining to run for office. The gubernatorial election was a toss-up and it was anyone's race. And as you can see the results on the top right, the Democrat Laura Kelly won against Republican Kris Kobach. In addition, before 2018, all 4 congressional districts of Kansas were controlled by Republicans. After 2018, Democrats picked up 1 seat and came close to winning a 2nd congressional seat by about a percentage point. Strong Democratic performances in the state in 2018 has made Kansas a competitive Senate election for this year's Senate elections. For this reason, choosing the right Republican nominee is of the utmost importance. This primary has been competitive because although Kobach has name recognition, his opponents have attacked him for not being able to win the competitive 2018 gubernatorial election and said that if he couldn't win the last gubernatorial election, then he certainly cannot win this year's Senate election. We are now going to take a look at the endorsements of each candidate. Since there is no information on Hamilton's endorsements, we will only be taking a look at the endorsements of Kobach and Marshall. Kobach has received endorsements from former South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint, conservative commentators Ann Coulter and Lou Dobbs, state legislator Michael Hauser, and from 13 different organizations and 10 other notable individuals. Most of the organizations that have endorsed Kobach are pro-life and gun rights groups. As for Marshall, he has been endorsed by outgoing incumbent Senator Pat Roberts, former Kansas Senator and former presidential candidate Bob Dole, former Kansas Congressman Kevin Yonder, former Kansas Governor Jeff Collier, and from 10 other organizations. Organizations that have endorsed Marshall are pro-life, agricultural, and religious groups. Basing off of this, it shows that many notable politicians have not gotten involved in this competitive primary, and it has mainly been grassroots organizations and lobbying groups that have been involved in this competitive primary. As for the few politicians that have given out their endorsements, most of them have served Kansas and most have endorsed Roger Marshall, and although this doesn't give anyone an advantage, this could slightly favor Marshall since most notable politicians who have name recognition have endorsed Marshall, and some voters familiar with these politicians might vote for Marshall. We will now take a look at the money raised by each campaign. On the top left, it shows that Hamilton has raised about $3.6 million, followed by Marshall, who has raised about $2.7 million, with Kobach raising close to $930,000. The bar graph on the top right shows how much of the funding has been either from in-state or out of state. To make things easier, I drew 3 arrows down on the candidates we are covering in this video so you can easily locate them. According to the bar graph, it shows that Marshall has received most of the money for his campaign in-state, and the same goes for Hamilton. However, Kobach has received most of his funding out of state. Looking down on the type of contribution for each campaign, it shows that Kobach has raised most of his money through large individual contributions, and a significant number of his contributions came from small donors. PAC money and self-financing has contributed very less in the money raised for his campaign. Like Kris Kobach, Roger Marshall has raised most of his money through large individual contributions, and a significant number of contributions came from PACs, and a tiny portion of his campaign contributions came from small donors. Bob Hamilton's case is different. Almost all of his money he raised was through candidate self-financing, which means the vast majority of the money raised by Hamilton has been through his own money. One thing is clear from these data, and that is that it does not favor Hamilton, since the money he raised was not through his supporters and he has mainly relied on himself for fundraising, which shows that he is not a preferable choice amongst voters. As for whether this data favors Kobach or Marshall, that's debatable. In my opinion, I believe this slightly favors Marshall, since most of the money that he has raised is with individual contributions, and most of that money was from in-state, as shown by the bar graph. Moving on now to the polling data of this race. According to the polls, it shows that for the most part, Kobach has led in most of the polls and Roger Marshall has led once before. The polling data shows that this race has mainly been a matchup between Kobach and Marshall, since they have both emerged as the top two contenders. Hamilton is at a distant third, and makes sense considering the money raised data we saw in the previous slide, which shows that Hamilton hardly raised any money amongst individuals, which shows you that he doesn't have much support amongst voters. We will now take a look at Kobach's electoral history. For the purposes of this video, we will only cover his primary election electoral history and not the general elections. According to this data, he has won all of his primaries. In 2004 and 2018, he narrowly won competitive primary elections. He won the 2004 congressional primary by a percentage point and the 2018 gubernatorial primary election by less than a percentage point. As for the primaries he took part for Secretary of State of Kansas, he has won those comfortably. This gives an advantage to Kobach, considering that he managed to win extremely competitive primaries, and shows that the odds are in his favor when it comes to winning primary elections, and this primary election foreshadows a narrow victory for him. Finally, we will wrap things up with my analysis. Considering that this year's Senate election will be competitive for Kansas, it has also made this year's primary election competitive. Kobach has an advantage since he clearly has name recognition, since he has been a politician in Kansas for over a decade. The money raised data slightly gives an advantage to Marshall in my opinion, but this is debatable considering the fact that it gives both an advantage depending on which perspective you're looking from. The polling data gives an advantage to Kobach since he has consistently led in the polls. For this primary election, it's been organizations and lobbying firms that have been more involved than notable politicians, considering the endorsements we saw for each candidate. I honestly believe that Kris Kobach will narrowly win his primary election, considering the fact that he has name recognition, has won all of his primary elections, even the competitive ones, and almost all of his campaign contributions shows that he is a preferable choice amongst voters. And now, I ask you, who do you think will win the 2020 Kansas Senate Republican primary election on August 4, 2020? Make sure to make your comments down below. In the meantime, that's all for now. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Turn on the bell icon to be notified whenever I post. Please comment or suggest down below, as this will help me improve my future videos. Follow me on Twitter at political_whiz. Thanks for watching.